Welcome to Knife Chats. If you like this video, please take a moment to leave a comment. Thank you.
One of those questions that often come up is, I'm looking to purchase a first knife for an individual. Do you have any recommendations? And the cop-out is usually, nah, not really, because I don't know the person, and you really should buy a knife that the person is going to like. And I've used that cop-out on more than one occasion, but when I start thinking about it a bit, there are some guidelines that I would give for a person who is looking at purchasing a first knife for an individual. I still think you do need to know that individual. You need to know their capabilities with a knife, and also you need to know things like their age, their dexterity, how easy it is for them to operate a knife, and things of that nature, and also the maturity of the individual. All of those things should come into play when purchasing a knife. With that said, let's take a look at a few knives that I think would make a good first knife for an individual. Now, the very first one I would suggest is something like this, especially if the person is like 2 or 3 years old. A toy knife. That way you'll get them interested in a knife, and they probably will not be able to hurt themselves or anyone else with it. Notice plastic blade. But it has some cool things on it that a little kid would kind of like. You've got the magnifying glass. You got a spoon. You got a fake screwdriver cap lifter. Basically all the kind of tools that if you carry a Swiss Army knife and you have a child, they would probably be interested in something like this as a toy, so that they could play grown-up with it. So think of toy knives as a first knife for young children, because it'll get them interested in other knives, and you can actually use something like this to teach a child how to be safe with a knife, like by saying, you never do this with a knife because a real knife will cut you, things of that nature. And you can see, everything about the knife. So it would be a nice way to introduce a young child to knives without really risking harm to the child. Now let's move on to real knives and the possibilities with them. Now at the very top, we have a fixed blade knife in a sheath. Kids have already used fixed blade knives most likely. They've used them in the kitchen and stuff. They may have peeled an apple or something like that. So getting them something like a little bird and trout knife, something that is an appropriate size for their hand, might be an ideal knife for them. And you can teach them all sorts of knife safety with the cutting edge. They'll probably already know quite a bit of it if they've ever handled a kitchen knife. So this would be an ideal solution for you. Start them off with a fixed blade knife. In this case, it's a little Rough Rider knife with moon glow scales, so it's glow in the dark scales. So that would be something that might really appeal to a younger child, to have a knife that actually glows in the dark. You've got a nice sheath that covers the knife up, so when he's not using it or she's not using it, it's safe for them to hold and carry. So think about a fixed blade knife for a first knife, because the chances of them hurting themselves might be less than dealing with the fiddliness of a folding knife. So a fixed blade knife for a first knife might be the ideal solution. Another option would be like an open L, such as this. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to have the collar lock on it. Matter of fact, depending on your child, you may not want them to have the collar lock. But the nice thing about an open L is you can grab the blade and you open it all the way yourself. So you're operating it that way. When you're closing it, you have to close it all the way down yourself, so you know where that blade is when you're closing it. So the chances of, with your typical slip joint, for instance here, with your typical slip joint, that blade closes real fast, it might snap on a kid's finger. But with this kind of knife, he's going to be closing it himself, or she's going to be closing it herself, and the chances of her cutting herself are less than with a typical slip joint. And if you want to teach them lessons about how knives close, you can always leave the ring lock open or the collar lock open, but you can also close it to show them how the blade then becomes safer for them to operate with. So an Opinel or Opinel, whatever way you want to pronounce it, is probably a good choice. This one is the number 8. I would not go a whole lot smaller than that. A lot of people think I need to get a child a small knife, but that's not really the case. The smaller the knife, the more fiddly it gets, and the more likely that they could actually have an accident with it. So, maybe one with a 3-inch handle would be okay, but I would not go much smaller than like a 3-inch knife for a kid. I think 3.5 inches would probably be better, a better length for a knife handle. 3.5 inch long handle that will usually give you a blade length that would be legal to carry in most places. It would be like a 2.5 inch blade, more than enough for most kids. So here's one that I would strongly recommend for a first knife for a person who's never really carried a knife and you want to introduce them to folding knives, something like an Opinel. In another video I talked about these knives, and this knife was not for me, but I can see how this knife would be a great knife for a first knife for somebody who is just getting introduced to folding knives. Now, for the most part, I would choose something like this. Otherwise, if you're looking at a slip joint, something that's an easy open kind of knife, so you can grab a lot of the blade. This one is a slimline trapper, and you see it's easy for me to open it just by holding the blade all the way, and I can actually close it all the way by also holding the blade. And then when I get more comfortable with it and more familiar with it, then I can snap it shut. And this would be a good idea for a younger child, is to learn how to open and close the knife, feeling that tension on the blade, so they know when that's going to close and when they know they need to keep their fingers out of the way. Because this is not a lockback, it's one that they need to learn also how to perhaps hold the blade a little up there so it will not accidentally close on them, but more importantly, learn that it is for cutting downward and not for twisting or pushing this way, poking things, because then it might close on you. So this would be something for somebody who is a little more knowledgeable or has a little more wisdom or a little more maturity, so that they would be able to operate the knife, get used to the knife, and get used to the way slip joints close, so that they know to keep their hands out of that blade closing on them. And I would probably start with something like this. This is about 4 inches long. You could go with like a 3.5 inch long knife also. They do make them, but get something that has a lot of blade that is exposed, an easy open kind of knife, and that would probably be a really good choice. Again, I would not go with like a peanut or something. It's just too small for their hands and more likely for them to actually get cut. So, a good medium size or large size knife with a blade that they can control when they're opening and closing, so that they can get used to the way a slip joint works. Now, if the child is a little older, or if the person's a little older and you think they're smart enough and have enough maturity to deal with knives that have blades on both sides, nothing like an equal end penknife for somebody to start off with, especially if it's something that would appeal to them. This would be something I could see a grandparent giving to a grandchild, simply because if the grandchild was watching a grandparent use something like this, they may want a knife just like granddad had or grandma had also. And so, it would be a good knife for somebody to learn with. And the fact that, if they know enough to keep their fingers out of the way of it, a nice penknife would be a good choice. don't go with a lot of blades or anything. The more blades you have, the more likely things would go wrong. This one, is nice, a little boker. So there's an option for a first knife. And while we're at it, let's move on up. We have this here. This is the Victorinox Recruit. No back tools on this, but it would be a great knife for a person who's looking at a first Swiss Army knife. Now, Swiss Army also makes a first knife, which is a single blade knife without a point, which is also a good option. But the Recruit is a good option because it has most of the tools you find on most Swiss Army knives. So, there's two blades on it again. But you have your can opener and your little screwdriver here, and then you have the cap lifter and screwdriver on the opposite end, and then a small pin blade on the back side here, and then the large spear blade. So if they're looking for, if you think they're mature enough to handle something with multiple blades, this might be a good option to start with. I think this would be a better option than actually a classic or something, because once again, this is big enough so that those little hands can fiddle with it and actually open and close it, but it's not so large that they could get in serious trouble with it. So like the Victorinox Recruit, I think would be a great knife for a person who's looking for a first Victorinox or first Swiss Army knife for a child. And finally, if the child is somebody who's really more interested in a modern folder and they really like the looks of modern folders or something, maybe consider grabbing some kind of slip joint Spyderco. Now this is one of the clippy tools. I would probably get something a little bit larger for a first timer knife, but the idea of using a slip joint is probably a better idea than grabbing something with a fancy locking mechanism or something, because they're going to have to figure out how to use that lock and everything. And we've seen adults who know knives who have problems with some of the locks on modern folders. So a slip joint Spyderco might be just a deal, and it's modern enough that they'll be happy with it. And once again, you've got a lot of blade here to hold on to, so you can actually learn how to open and close it while holding the blade and keeping your hand out of the way of the, or your fingers out of the path of the closing blade. This one also has a pair of scissors, something that would also appeal to a child. This one, let's see, how long is this thing? Yeah, this is only like 2.5 inches long, so this would not probably be the exact one I would choose. But I definitely would not go any smaller than this for a Spyderco as a first knife for a child. I would actually go with something like maybe the Robin or something, or the Man Bug or something of that nature. Something bigger than this that they would be able to carry and hold and open. But definitely I would go with like a slip joint. Maybe the UKPK would be a good choice because it is a slip joint, it's bigger than this, and it's usually legal to carry in most places. And the fact that they can actually, have a lot of blade to hold on to when they're opening and closing it in the beginning would be a good solution to me. And then later, once they know it a little bit better, they can start letting it close regularly. So for a modern folder, something like the UKPK or something of that nature, some kind of Spyderco slip joint would be a good option as far as I'm concerned. So that's my thoughts on a good first knife for a responsible young adult or a responsible child who is looking for a first knife. So there's plenty of options there, I think. I don't know. Let me know what you think would make a great first knife for a child. These are the kind of options I would look at.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Knife Chats, and if you did, please like and share it with your friends. Comments are always welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon.